Hey everyone, my name is Nick Eubank and I'm a faculty member here at Duke and a member of the Masters of Interdisciplinary Data Science team. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the VS Code editor, also known as Virtual Studio Code, which you may be interested in using in both in this bootcamp but also over the course of this entire year. This is going to be the first in a series of videos where I show you how to set up VS Code for working in Python, as long as a number of the different features like integration with Jupyter and how to set up connections to remote virtual machines. In this video today, though, I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the nice things about VS Code and spend a couple minutes playing with it just so you can get a sense of what working with VS Code looks like and feels like from a data science perspective. So before I get into a demonstration, though, I think the first thing that I want to do is just get the elephant, address the elephant in the room, which is whether I am arguing that VS Code is the best editor. So there's almost nothing you can do that's more likely to start a fight than try to make a declaration about which editor is the best. People tend to have incredibly strong feelings about whether you should be using VS Code, PyCharm, Emacs, Vim, any one of a number of these different tools. And I will admit that from my own perspective, I think the answer to this question should be that the best editor is the one that you feel comfortable and productive using. And I think that the answer to that question is going to vary a lot from person to person and context to context for a number of reasons. I mean, the first is that all of us do different work, right? So the tool that is best for a software engineer may be different than the tool that is best for a data analyst. It's also the case that the best editor is going to depend on how you like to work. Different people are just going to have different tastes in terms of what they want from the editors that they're using. And then lastly, there are a lot of network effects when it comes to data science tools in general and editors in particular, by which I mean oftentimes the tool that is best is not just a function of the intrinsics of the tool, the question of whether it has the best menu structure or the best keyboard shortcuts, but also what the people around you are using. If you go to work for a company where everyone is using PyCharm for Python development, you probably are going to want to end up using PyCharm. And a lot of the reason for that is that if you run into problems or get stuck, you can just turn to the person next to you and ask them for help, right? If your entire company is using a given tool, odds are that all the major pain points are things that they've already worked out. And so, what other people are using matters a lot for determining what's the best editor in a given context. So, no, I'm not necessarily arguing that VS Code is the best editor. But I think it's a good choice for a lot of people. So I want to make sure as a resource that I introduce it and give you kind of a set of appropriate instructional videos to ensure that if you decide this is something you want to use, you're well positioned to do so. So why do I think VS Code is potentially a good choice? So the first reason is that it's a very popular editor. A Stack Overflow survey found that it's the primary editor of more than 50% of developers who responded. And a JetBrains survey in 2020 found that VS Code was the second most popular editor used by Python data scientists. I should note that the one that came in first was the editor developed by JetBrains, so take that with a grain of salt. In addition, before we started making all these videos and things, we surveyed students to find out what tools they were using, and we found that by the end of the first and the second year, VS Code was definitely the editor that most of our students in the MIDS program were gravitating towards. And so, I think, as I mentioned, network effects are important, and it seems like VS Code is well positioned in that respect. Obviously, being popular doesn't necessarily mean it's the best, but it does mean that you're more likely to run into other people using it, finding more help files online, and there are a lot of people developing auxiliary tools and extensions for VS Code because of its popularity. It's also a very modern editor. It was only developed a few years ago, and so it's built on web technology. It works on all platforms identically, and so, you don't have to worry about what type of your computer you're using. It'll look basically the same wherever you are. It was also built with things like cloud integration in mind, right? So it's very adapted working with remote virtual machines and connecting to Docker images and things like that. It's open source, so people are developing for it constantly. There's a lot out there in that regard. And then lastly, it has a very familiar interface. And I will admit that I find this a major plus for an editor. Not because, everything that I'm going to do is moving my mouse around to go to drop-down menus to run my code, but because I think it really facilitates discoverability. VS Code, like nearly all modern editors, just has an unbelievable number of features, and it can be very easy to lose track of what the editor is capable of doing, or to go find some feature that you use occasionally but not a lot. And so VS Code looks a lot like any web browser you've used, basically. And so I think it's very nice for people getting started because it's a relatively straightforward platform on which to figure out what it's capable of doing. And then once you become more of a power user, you learn keyboard shortcuts, you start making modifications to settings, you customize it for yourself, you design it so you never have to use the menu, you just know keyboard shortcuts. But you always have that as kind of a fallback, which I find really appealing. Okay, so enough abstract. I think the best thing to do at this point is probably just to show you a little bit of what it looks like to play with VS Code. And so what I'm going to do is load up a session here, and we can talk through a little bit of what we see. So first, as a new window pops up, the first thing you can immediately see is that it looks a lot like most web browsers that you probably played with. We have tabs along the top for different documents. We have kind of the menus that you would kind of expect along the top. And then there's also this little sidebar, which has a lot of convenient things. So for example, if we want to open a folder, VS Code demo, I'm just going to open that up. Right, we immediately see a list of all the different files that we're working on. It also does some nice smart things, like the icon on the left is just reflecting the file type, which it has been able to infer by the file suffix and what's there at the end. And so, this is a very nice kind of familiar framework. If you're trying to figure out how to make this little sidebar go away, if you find it's in the way, you can, click at things and see what happens. Great, turns out that makes the sidebar go away. You can also go up to View. Unsurprisingly, View controls all sorts of little configurations about what appears in your editor. And so you have this easy kind of familiar interface for finding how these different types of things work. Now, in these videos, we're going to emphasize how you do work in Python. Oh, right, the other thing I should mention. In VS Code, there's also something called the command palette. The command palette is basically like a command line for the entire VS Code system. So this is kind of a text box where you have access to any and all of the capabilities of VS Code. I think basically every function that is available to VS Code is a thing that you have access to from this session. So, let's suppose that I want to create a new integrated terminal. I type terminal, it shows me the command that I want. It shows me the keyboard shortcut, which is nice. So now next time I can remember what the relevant commands are, and if I hit return, I can open up a little terminal session over here on the left that gives me the opportunity to kind of look at my files and run a normal bash console over here. So that command palette is very appealing if you're a person who kind of never wants to work with the mouse, or you're looking for something where you remember the name but not where it's hidden. So most of these videos, we're going to talk about Python development. The VS Code is not language specific. It works with any language, whether that's R, Python, Julia, C, C++, et cetera, It's a language agnostic platform. But because we're doing a Python bootcamp, we're going to talk about that here. And so I've opened up this kind of straightforward Python document here. And the first thing you can see is that VS Code, once you've installed an extension for Python, which we'll talk about in the next video, that empowers it to deal with Python, the first thing you'll notice is it knows how to highlight the syntax to kind of make everything readable, right? So strings get colored in red automatically, libraries get highlighted in blue. You can also see that if you hold your mouse over something, you get the opportunity to just read through the documentation for whatever you're mousing over. It's a very nice, convenient way to get access to documents for different functions and things like that. But what it's able to do is actually go significantly beyond just highlighting to actually testing and checking your code as you go. This is a tool called linting. And the idea of linting is basically that as you type, Python will evaluate what you've typed and decide if it is valid. So in this case, what you can see is that I opened the print statement with a double quote and I closed it with a single quote. which in Python is not allowed. And so VS Code has put this red squiggly line beneath it to say, hey, there's a problem with your code. If I put my mouse over, it says string literal is unterminated, as in the string does not ever stop. We can also see over here on the right-hand side, these red dots on the right side are flagging where the problems emerged. One of them is up here at line 14. The other one is down at 18 because it's confused given the string above didn't finish why there's a string going on down here. But then we can fix that. So this is called linting, something you want in any editor that you're working with, and it's a really nice functionality. The other very nice thing that you get out of an editor like VS Code is code formatting that occurs automatically. So there are certain libraries that will basically take a Python script and then reformat it to make sure that it fits all relevant Python style guides. So that if you commit to an open source project, nobody fights with you and your code always looks kind of reasonable and straightforward and you can tell what's going on. And so just to give you an example, plus 7 times 9 on y equals 5 plus 5 plus 5, x plus y. A element of the standard Python style guide, and this is not obviously the most terrible style to get wrong, but it's an example of it, is that you usually want to put spaces between all of your different operators to make it more readable. And so what's going to happen is when I type Command S to save this file, it will immediately run the file through the formatter, and now it will update this code so that it has spaces in all the relevant places. And this will do things where if you have like a very long line of code with like lots of nested operations and parentheses and, things like that, it will move things around and group them in such a way that, lines tend not to go over 80 characters in width and everything gets kind of reorganized very nicely. So this is a really nice feature just for helping to ensure that your code always kind of looks very nice and consistent, right? So here's another example. If I went in here and even though it's correct to use single quotes here, I'm now using both double quotes for some strings and single quotes for other ones, and that is generally considered bad Python style. So if I save this, we'll see, again, it just switches these back to double quotes just for consistency across everything going on. Now, obviously, we don't just want to write Python code. We also want the opportunity to run it, and that is also facilitated by VS Code in 2 ways. So the first one is that we can just run the entire file in from the command line, right? So if I right-click, I can scroll down here, and we see run Python file in terminal. So I'll select that. We see a Python terminal opening up. It's running the code. The only major output you actually get from it is the hello from the print hello, and then it closes the session. Oftentimes, though, we don't just want to run a file, right? Instead, what we want to do is run kind of individual lines of code interactively so we can kind of keep testing and exploring as we write our code. So I'm going to highlight a couple lines, and I'm going to say run selection in the Python terminal. What this is going to do is open a Python session and run those 2 lines. And now, the Python session is still open over here on the right. Yeah, see, there you go. And so I can play around in the Python session in the right, but I can also run my code over here. Now, to be clear, obviously you don't want to right-click every time you want to run code. And if you look down here on my computer, I've customized this a little bit so that running a selection is Command-Shift-Return. So if I highlight this line of code and type Command-Shift-Return, it runs over here on the side. And now if I hit DF, I can see the output from that. Not everyone likes working in a vanilla Python terminal like this. So for example, this is all text and you're not allowed to have images or anything a little bit more sophisticated. So the other thing that is facilitated by, actually I should bring that back and close that session. Okay. So the other thing that VS Code lets you do is work with Jupyter consoles, which is, if you don't know a lot about Jupyter, don't worry about it, but it basically gives you, oops, I used the wrong keyboard shortcut, see? Which is you can also work in what's called an interactive console, which is IPython or Jupyter. We'll talk more about that in a later video, where stuff is much kind of richer media when you're looking at different images, right? So We can print out our data frames. And for example, down here in this, we have a plot. And if I'm working in one of these interactive sessions and I create a plot, we just get to see the plot in the session, right? Whereas you can't do that with a regular text interface. So that's great, and it's powered by Jupyter. So you may find yourself asking, what about Jupyter notebooks? The people who made VS Code recognize that obviously it's going to be the case that data scientists want Python notebooks. And so they have their own implementation of Jupyter notebooks, IPython notebooks, that runs within VS Code. Again, if this is not familiar to you, don't worry about it. But for those of you who are aware, it has this standard Jupyter notebook type functionality. Fully, everything works the same way. A notebook saved here runs in the Jupyter natively the same way. But anytime it sees a .ipynb file, it recognizes a Jupyter notebook and it renders it in this particular manner. The other thing that I want to make sure that I show you, which is an example of some of this rich functionality, which is if I go back and I run this code again over here, where I import this data frame, one of the extra things you can do in VS Code, which I find really nice, is you can actually load up the whole data frame and have the opportunity to scroll through your data and look at it on kind of a line-by-line basis in a rich context. If you're a data scientist, it's really nice to just be able to look at your data sometimes. And so this is just a really convenient tool for getting a good sense and feel for your data. One of the other things that VS Code does very nicely is it has GitHub integration. So these files are living in a GitHub repository. Again, if you don't work with GitHub very much yet, this may not mean a lot to you. But what I can do is click on this and it'll show me what changes I have made between the last commit for this repository and what the files look like right now. Right, so it's showing me like I added this print statement and some of these adding of numbers together. I added an extra line break here, just these little things that have changed in the document. And if I want to commit those, I can just hit plus to stage it. And then I say a few extra lines for video. I can commit those changes, right? So you can work basically with Git and GitHub this way, which can be really convenient and nice to work with. So the other thing that's kind of incredible, and I will admit this is one of my very favorite features of VS Code, is that because it's modern and it's really designed, for use in interacting with remote servers, it has a tool that is designed to connect to remote virtual machines. Now I've configured this, so I'm just going to kind of show you what it looks like as you kind of with it a little bit set up. But the basic idea is if you know how to SSH into a remote computer, right, which means you can connect from the command line, then you can tell VS Code to connect to that computer. It will go onto that virtual machine, install the software necessary for VS Code to work with it effectively. And then you can open these sessions where even though, this is VS Code running on my computer, the files that I see here on the Explorer are files on a remote computer that's running in the cloud, right? So I can edit the file here. When I save the changes, those changes propagate. Oh, I don't have my formatter installed yet. So one of the other kind of nice things about VS Code is if you do something that doesn't work, it'll suggest a way to like make it work better. I'm not going to install it right now. But this terminal is not a terminal on my personal computer. This terminal that we see down here is actually an interface to this virtual machine running on a Duke server. And if I run this code, that code is running on the virtual computer, right? Not on my personal computer, which is really nice. The other thing that I will flag, I should have shown this before, but you can also use VS Code and easily switch between lots of different Python installations, right? So it's often the case that on a single computer, you'll actually have a few different versions of Python installed, or you might have instances of Python with different packages, and you can easily switch between which one you want to use. On the virtual machine, there's kind of only these two that are here, so we're going to use Python 3 because you should only use Python 3 at this point. But that's the type of flexibility that you get from that kind of stuff. All right, so we can close that. And I think that's most of, oh, right, the one other great thing. So the one other thing to be aware of is VS Code, again, because it's from the age of the cloud, is designed to synchronize both with GitHub and to save all your settings. So once you give it your GitHub login, you can set it to synchronize all your settings, which means if you open up VS Code on any other computer anywhere, and you log in, you can just immediately bring all of your settings, which means if you have unusual keyboard shortcuts, if you have certain font preferences, color preferences, etc., those will immediately propagate to every other computer. And obviously, most of us, when we play with an editor for a long time, get very attached to certain little tweaks and settings. So that ability to synchronize settings is a really, really powerful advantage of VS Code, at least in my opinion. Okay. So I think that's all I have for today. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what VS Code is about and kind of gives you a sense of where it fits in the editor ecosystem. As I said, maybe it's the right tool for you, maybe it's not, but I just want to make sure you know it's something that's available. We'll have links below to bring you to a set of other videos helping you figure out how to install Python on your own computer and install VS Code, how to get it set up and get code running. We'll set up a video on Jupyter integration for some of those fancier console settings, and a video on this SSH connection, how you connect to a remote virtual machine and run things that way. And hopefully that's a big help. Thanks so much.